Thank you. When we left off yesterday, we were talking about changes in the 2000s between, I guess, with respect to the province's role in habitat management and the riparian areas. And I wanted to also ask if there was any, at that time, particularly you, Mr. Crow, was there any increase in development activities in the province in that period in the 2000s?
Yes, there was. Starting in the late 1990s and definitely picking up through the early 2000s right into essentially 2008-09 it was a very intensive pace of development through many sectors within BC. Resource extraction sectors, recreational development, infrastructure expansion, railways, highways, pipelines, new pipelines, as well as what's called looping, which means one pipeline does not have sufficient capacity, so a pipeline company will twin it. They'll put a second pipeline in. So the population was growing. Has been growing within BC quite steadily, and there was expansion in all elements of urban and commercial industries sufficient, in equivalently to that general population growth.
And did you have at that time any changes in staffing in your OHAB offices?
In the early 2000s or through the 2000s?
Sort of in 2003 and onward.
Well, first, to help for context for my answer, I need to explain that prior to the 2000s, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans had been developing a number of different programs. We call them B-Base or Sunset programs. I think you've heard of them, spoken of before, such as the Green Plan. It was a sort of, and that was followed by other programs called, there was, well, we often named them after ministers, the Mifflin Plan and the Anderson Plan. There was components to these larger plans that delivered specific projects. Examples would be the Habitat Restoration Semi-Audit Enhancement Program, and one that was particular to the Habitat Management Program was called HCSP, or the Habitat Conservation Stewardship Program. This was essentially resources provided to us to develop and expand upon components of our habitat program to deliver a wider spectrum of strategies within the habitat policy. One critical part of this was to try to expand or create partnerships and essentially understanding capacity and cooperation amongst different sectors, and we provided resources to industry, to First Nations, and to local government to understand DFO's interests in terms of habitat conservation and protection, and bring them on as partners. So through these sequence of programs, one that usually followed after another, there was a general increase in the habitat management program's capacity. While sunsetting, individuals were brought on, and then they were actually made indeterminate. They became part of our core staffing contingent. Added to that, there was a number of decisions that affected mostly Central and Arctic, but there was a decision of Pacific region to join that, where we, it was called the Blueprint Initiative, but there was new resources that came to mostly Central and Arctic region, but also to the BC interior specifically, to increase our role in freshwater habitat management. So over the 1990s into the early 2000s, we were in a growth phase in terms of our resources and program delivery and expansion of many elements of the habitat policy, again, speaking to trying to deliver a broader spectrum of strategies within the habitat policy. In 2004, that essentially came to an end. There was a number of decisions that reprioritized federal funding, and these B-based programs were once the last one ran out, there was no continuation, and we went through an economic review period. It was acronym ERC, economic review. I cannot remember the C, I apologize, which determined that we were going to be realigning resources to other governmental priorities. This resulted in a change in staffing levels as well. So to get, with all that background and context, and I apologize if it was too long, and I'll speak specifically about the BC Interior, but it does expand to the larger regional habitat management program, did go through a period of downsizing. Would you like me to get into specific numbers?
I've got some documents on that I'll get to in a minute. I just wanted to get a general sense that there was a downsizing. And was this, when you were talking about the economic review, was it the Expenditure Review Committee?
Yes, thank you.
Is that what it was? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right. And was that similar experience to that you had in the Lower Mainland, Mr. Salome?
Well, as Michael said, there was a bit more of an expansion through that period in the BC Interior. So the Laura Fraser office didn't really expand, but we were involved on the downside to some extent.
Okay. And so that left you, I take it, with fewer staff to do some of the programs that you had, your just general programs that you needed to maintain. Is that right?
That's correct. We had to determine what our priorities were relative to our capacity to be as effective and efficient as we could with the resources we did have.
Okay, and so how did you address this? How did you resolve some of these capacity issues?
Essentially, the managers in the BC Interior initiated a process called developing operational principles. Later you'll hear us, I expect we'll be talking about operational statements, but this was pre-EPMP, where the BC Interior went through essentially a detailed review process of all our programs and assigned priorities to each of those program elements relative what we assessed as the managers to be the relative risk in terms of potential harm to habitat and therefore to fish. And then essentially determine how many resources it was to take to deliver on each of those program priorities, and essentially determine, based on essentially a triage system, what we could and could not continue to support as a program, what elements of our program we're going to essentially receive a different service level, be delivered in a different manner, or we were just not going to be able to attend to at all.
As you mentioned that you developed different ways of delivering services. Were some of those ways described as streamlining processes? Yes, definitely.
We developed a number of streamlining processes. Essentially, that would be a reliance on guidance documents created by either the department or other agencies, such as best management practices.
Are those the same thing as the fact sheets we talked about yesterday?
Essentially, yes. I'd say best management practices, operational statements, fact sheets are all a form of guidance document to undertake their development activities or activities in general in a manner that was least likely to harm fish and fish habitat.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the best management practices or fact sheets. First of all, what kinds of things did they address and how are they created?
Well, essentially, they're created by bringing together experts on a subject and asking them to use their judgment and expertise to create a document that provides guidance on how best to conduct an activity in a manner that meets our program objectives. And that usually essentially means measures that an individual should take to avoid or mitigate harm. They cover a wide spectrum of issues, how to construct bridges, how to stabilize shorelines, place water intakes into water bodies, bridge cleaning and maintenance, a wide range of different activities.
Was the province involved in developing any of the fact sheets or the best management practice documents?
Many of them were provincially written documents. Some of them were co-authored. We would sometimes borrow from other jurisdictions as well in the creation of these.
And how would Fisheries and Oceans use those documents?
Essentially, we would try to, if someone approached us to conduct a development activity that we felt could be managed through one of these best management practices, we would essentially, instead of responding through a letter of advice or direct engagement, we would provide them the fact sheet or best management practice and essentially tell them to please follow this document, and then contact us if they could not meet the measures or standards within the document. We would often try to deliver them through other agencies, make them available through front desk kiosks at different government offices, place them on websites and other manners.
There's one best management practice called that relates to danger trees. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And what is the danger tree best management practice?
This BMP relates to a common challenge for us is that large, very large, or mature trees on property that has reached an age or is being susceptible to disease has a chance of falling. From a biological perspective, that's great. We actually want those trees falling into stream bodies. They're a great source of cover and nutrients and benefit stream configuration. However, for a property owner, they can pose a danger to themselves, their family, and their property. So the idea is that this is a best management practice on essentially recognizing that human safety is critical, that we will not stop someone from removing a danger tree. The challenge is often an individual wants to remove trees for aesthetic or landscaping reasons, and people were commonly removing trees under the pretext of a danger tree, wherein in fact it was a perfectly fine, healthy tree, and therefore we had set standards as to when and how an individual was to remove it. And that essentially was the best management practice was they were to get an arborist to certify that the tree was a hazard, and then measures to remove it after they have such certification.
And has that process worked satisfactorily to your view?
It's an improvement. It seems like a small issue, but habitat management is about managing, in many ways, the small issues. The cumulative impacts of many property owners removing many, trees, when put together over time, has an effect. You add that small development or that small activity to many others, and you start seeing over time that the cumulative incremental loss of riparian function and therefore contribution to fish and fish habitat. So I'd say it's better. I think that there's still a tendency for individuals to take the initiative to remove trees when they're not necessarily still a hazard, but it does provide more guidance. Sorry, thank you.
And you said a certified arborist needs to make an assessment of the state of the tree before it's removed. Is that process worked out consistently?
The challenge is that there's a whole spectrum of certifications for arborists, and that some of them, I would say, are more interested in meeting the property owner's objectives and fulfilling a professional obligation.
Okay. And is there a requirement to report the use of a BMP to DFO, or does DFO do any compliance monitoring with respect to the use of the BMPs after they've been applied?
I can't remember the details. I believe there is an expectation to notify us under that BMP, but I can't say that clearly. I can't quite recollect. There is some local jurisdictions do have a bylaw for danger trees as well, and that there would be some reporting to the city in those circumstances.
Okay. And what about monitoring for compliance by DFO?
It's deemed to be a relatively low-risk activity in light of many other monitoring priorities for the department. I'm not aware of any monitoring that we have, as a department, have done, but that it could be possible in other areas of the Pacific region.
And then another BMP is the Shoreline Erosion Protection Guideline, which I think it refers to retaining walls in
Yes.
common language. Can you tell us about that one?
Yeah, this actually is one that's very problematic for the department, in that I'm just not quite sure where to start, but essentially many property owners purchase very nice lakeshore or stream shore properties for the purposes of enjoying the aesthetic values of the waterfront, and they want to modify their property in such a way to maximize the recreational benefit. And it's very common for individuals want to do some major foreshore modifications, including replacement of retaining walls, docks, sand importation, filling in the foreshore. And under the pretext of some small amount of erosion, they'll go in and completely modify the foreshore and say they've done it under a best management practice. And it's something that is very problematic for the department, and we have to we need to take a far different approach in managing these types of massive foreshore developments.
And so what has been done in that respect?
Sorry, I'm trying not to, it's for a specific issue, I don't want to make my answer too long, but essentially we need to engage with the province and change some of the province's Water Act regulation management practices on these foreshore areas, and actually get the BMP changed. I think it was a good idea. It was worth trying using this BMP to manage this kind of development activity, but in my opinion it has not succeeded, and that government, between the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the province, have to reassess the risk of this type of development activity and no longer allow it to be conducted under a BMP. This is I think it's always good to try, but when you have information that something is not working, that this is an example where you change your review processes.
And is there a Water Act, a BC Water Act approval required for changes to the to these retaining walls?
This is actually where it gets to be a real challenge, that under the Water Act of the province of British Columbia, they control works in and around a stream. So the definition of in and around is really what the problem is with this particular issue, in that works below the high water mark or essentially fall clearly within the jurisdiction of the Water Act. Retaining walls actually occur at the high water mark and above along the shoreline, and the province actually deems this not to be within the parameters of works in and around the stream, and therefore they do not actually feel they have a regulatory jurisdiction over this type of activity, and that's why they manage it through a BMP. So we believe, based on a series of environmental appeal decisions, that actually the province does have the jurisdiction, and we need to engage with the province at senior levels to get them to revisit their directions and opinion on where their authorities lie in this matter, so that they can manage this type of development activity under the Water Act. This actually leads, I think, to explain why we're relying on the province in this matter, needs a bit of an explanation. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans has its authorities under the Fisheries Act, and we can prosecute. Prosecutions are very time-consuming and very uncertain as to outcomes. It's often our attempt to work with partner agencies that have similar interests and try to determine which statutory or regulatory tool is the most appropriate to deal with the type of development activity. In many situations, it'll be a local government through their bylaws and building codes. In other circumstances, it will be through a provincial statute such as the Lands Act or the Water Act. And our opinion is, rather than pursuing some of these consistently problematic problems through Fisheries Act prosecution, that a permitting review by the province would be a better approach.
The riparian areas regulation, so I don't want to get into a lot of detail about that now, but I just want to understand, is there a gap between how that regulation would be applied and some of the issues that you're talking about here with respect to these erosion guidelines?
There's two gaps. The one is that the Water Act, as presently applied by the province, is below the natural boundary, the mean annual water mark, which is that means the average water elevation. And the riparian areas regulation that applies at the above the 1 and 5 year flood elevation. So there's actually a vertical distance between those two elevations that my understanding that neither the Provincial Water Act or the Riparian Areas Regulation applies to. The other gap would be that the Riparian Areas Regulation does not apply throughout all of BC, and even with the areas of BC it applies, it's not applied consistently, and so there's that gap as well.
All right, and when you talk about a gap of vertical distance, that may not sound like very much when you're looking at it straight up and down, but that could actually be on a low gradient, could extend for quite a period of space. Is that right?
Absolutely. An example in Shuswap Lake, it's a 40 centimeter difference in elevation. When you look at lower gradient foreshore areas, actually, which are often the most important for fish and fish habitat, it can extend for tens of meters. A gradient of 1 to 2% on a delta area will run for many, many meters.
Another, I don't know if you would consider this a BMP or another guidance document, is the 2004 in-stream works document. I want to ask Mr. Salami about that, excuse me. That's in Canada's document at tab 18. Is that also a BMP that's in use by DFO? Sorry, no, it's a tab 18 on Canada's list.
So as Michael described, we actually worked with our provincial colleagues through the 2000-2004 period to produce things like fact sheets or guidance documents. And my feeling is this is a bit of a culmination of those documents. The staff in the Surrey office of Ministry of Environment at that time were quite involved in pulling this together. And it describes a number of common activities that occur in around streams and what the best practices are for those activities. It gives a little bit of direction to a proponent or a developer or a contractor that might be doing work, that if they follow certain practices here, they're unlikely to need, for example, formal permits or authorizations. But in other cases, they might. It talks about things like beaver dams, and identifies that beaver dams actually create habitat by flooding areas that fish can then use. And so when one goes into remove a beaver dam to prevent flooding, they've got to be careful about how they do it, and provides direction around that.
Okay. I'll have that marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 1002.
And are there any other of these streamlining tools that were developed prior to the environmental the EPMP? I'm probably going to misname it if I try and go through that acronym.
I'd like to give a couple other examples. Yep. We talked a little bit yesterday about the land development guidelines and the stream stewardship series. One of the big things we tried to do was encourage local governments to adopt similar standards within their own government bylaws. And a number of municipalities did do that. They had either a tree protection or a riparian bylaw that would help protect riparian areas. Some of them began to hire arborists and implement their own tree management bylaws, and really took on a lot of the day-to-day management of those issues in their local municipalities. Within the FREMP program, for Fraser River Estuary Management Program, we start to look at what were common activities that were occurring in the Lower Fraser, and established a Track 1, Track 2, and Track 3 process. The Track 1 process being one where the Port Authority could assess those projects and use some standard BMPs to deal with those activities. There is a notification process where a representative on that committee would be aware of the project, but really the day-to-day work and paperwork was handled by the local Port Authority.
So the person that would be on that committee was a DFO person, is that what you're saying?
What we had was an environmental review committee where member agencies would sit around and review projects on a bi-monthly basis. What we did with this Track 1 process was let the Port Authority handle those instead.
Yeah, but was there Fisheries and Oceans involvement at any level within that port review?
If through the notification process we had concern with the information provided or the potential BMPs that would be applied, we could then notify the Port Authority and say, hey, we think this one needs a bit closer look.
Okay, and Track 2?
Track 2 was the majority of the projects where there was a feeling that those works had the potential to have significant impacts and that it would be worthy of a review and some kind of a formal response or tailored response.
By DFO?
We would coordinate the response with the FREMP program.
Okay, and the Track 3?
Typically more of a major project type activity. Eventually the Track 3 project became almost entirely handled by the major projects group at DFO and through the coordinated BC Environmental Assessment, Canadian Environmental Assessment Act process. So Track 3 didn't really apply that much.
And then there was a new plan, which Ms. Rumi has helpfully given me the name words in the acronym. It's the Environmental Process Modernization Plan. Were there additional changes made as a result of that plan?
Yes. Now, the EPMP was a national initiative. It had 5 initially and then 6 components, and I'll see if I can get them all. One of them was streamlining, looking at ways to streamline the review process. The other one was to improve consistency and coherence in DFO's response to developers and proponents, etc. Another one was improving the major projects review process. Another one was Michael, maybe you could help me out here. Was working with partnerships, and the 6th element that was added was the habitat compliance initiative.
Okay, well, if we can focus on the streamlining tools that were developed under the EPMP, what streamlining tools were developed?
One of the key ones was the operational statements.
Okay.
And basically, somewhere around 18 operational statements, they were called national operating statements for a while, and then were changed to operating statements, were developed.
All right, these were developed nationally, were they?
Yes.
Okay.
So if I can just clarify, there was a national set, then each region was allowed to, essentially not allowed to, but was able to modify that set and add extras to make them appropriate for specific regions.
Okay, so...
And just to clarify, an operational statement is essentially a best management practice.
But it's a national DFO-created document.
That is correct.
All right, and what was the purpose of these operational statements?
Well, a key statement in most of the operational statements is that if you carry out the activity identified in the operational statement consistent with the guidance in that statement, the department deemed that you would not be causing a harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. And that basically was the green light to tell people you didn't need to seek a formal authorization or any kind of review from the department.
And again, is this Was there notice required to DFO when those operational statements were used by people?
Well, under the Fisheries Act, there isn't a specific section that says you must apply. There's a section 35 says you cannot harmfully alter fish habitat. Section 35(2) says you can seek an authorization if desired, but there is not a specific requirement for notification or application. But within the operating statements, there is a statement that does request that people notify the department if they are utilizing the operational statement.
And have you found people to do that?
Well, we know who applies or notifies us, but yeah. I think it's a difficult one to assess.
And is there any kind of professional certification required that an operating statement has been complied with? Is there any kind of external review required?
Not that I'm aware of.
A number of them do recommend that a proponent hire a qualified professional to help in the design and construction, but it's not a requirement.
Okay. And what about monitoring for compliance? Does Fisheries and Oceans do any monitoring for compliance with operational statements?
Yes, they do. There's, as Carino said, there's a sixth element to EPMP, which is the Habitat Compliance Modernization Program, which is essentially our structured monitoring unit within the Habitat Management Program. And amongst other objectives of that monitoring program, monitoring for compliance of operational statements is a component. I cannot tell you how much monitoring they've done. Essentially there is some monitoring of operational statements, but I don't know what that is. The complicating factor is because notifications are voluntary. The only ones we can monitor are the people who issued notifications, and the expectation is the ones that provide us with notifications are essentially probably the people who are going to be more cooperative and likely to have done them in the manner that they were intended. So you're going to be monitoring a component that probably has a higher likelihood of being cooperative in attempting to fulfill the obligations and intentions of these operational statements.
What about, I guess, notice that's given to Fisheries and Oceans by neighbors or other parties, or just things that personnel might see when they're out doing field reviews? Has there been much compliance initiated through those other alternative ways?
Notification of from the general public and industry representatives is a very common way that we become aware of there's an activity that may be out of compliance or has not been received any kind of governmental review. So we rely heavily on our federal as well as provincial reporting lines to report occurrences of possible activities that have not been reviewed or permitted either through ourselves or the province.
Are these operational statements designed for any particular level of risk? For example, are they designed for low-risk projects, medium, high risk? Is that one of the factors that was determined as to what operational statements would be created?
That was the intention. Part of the EPMP program was to establish, quote, pathways of effects to describe how effects or activities might impact fish habitat, to then categorize outcomes as low, medium, or high risk, and then to apply things like operating statements to the low-risk activities.
And in your view, has that worked effectively? For example, is there a way to assess impacts on a cumulative basis? For example, if a subdivision was created and there was repeated compliance with operational statements, but there was a whole series of them done at the same time, has that been assessed?
No. So for some of the operating statements that are more maintenance based or really have limited impact on fish habitat, I think the assumption is okay. For other ones, and one that I have some concern with or have raised concern with in the past is, for example, the bridge operating statement. I think low risk is maybe not the right way to put it. They're potentially low impact if applied in an area with, say, minimal riparian habitat. But their impact is relatively certain. You're going to place a bridge over top of the riparian zone. There will not be riparian vegetation growing under that bridge. If it's just one small bridge in the middle of nowhere where there's limited riparian impact, it's a reasonable approach. If it's an area with significant development, there's large riparian trees that are important components of that stream, and you start to apply that operating statement, I think that would not be categorized as low risk. That's starting to get into the higher cumulative impact category.
Okay. So the bridge operating statement, are there any other concerns that you have with it other than just the fact that you could have several bridges in sequence and that would have a significant effect? Or bridges could be put in populated areas where there's other impacts ongoing?
Well, I think one of the items that people have picked up on is it says explicitly, if you follow this guideline, you will not be creating a harmful alteration. And it kind of sets an indication of what might be or might not be a harmful alteration. Some people have said, well, typical two-lane bridge and right-of-way is about 20 meters, so we could put in a two-lane bridge, have 20 meters of footprint over a creek, and that's not really a HAD. And they pointed that out as an example. And I think that's a dangerous statement to make and a dangerous interpretation for individuals to make.
Sure.
For example, many city lots aren't much wider than 20 meters. The suggestion is you can maybe not have 20 meters of riparian in your backyard anymore, and it's not a HAD. So there's dangerous interpretations or assumptions that come out of that document.
What about clearing zones associated with the operating statements? Is that, with the operating statements for bridge construction, is that a problem?
Well, if a bridge is put in initially with compliance with the operating statement, it might have minimal impact if there's minimal trees, but you then start getting into things like operational phases of that bridge where the local government or highways department that's operating that bridge would say, well, the trees beside it are leaning towards the bridge, now they're hazards, or we need to clear a little bit wider for sight lines. So I think there's a tendency to underestimate the potential impact from even something as small as a two-lane bridge.
And what about planning? How does the planning process work in with the use of these operational statements?
Well, that's another challenge with that particular operating statement. In many urban areas, there's potentially significant road networks that are established. And without some encouragement or regulatory role, there's a potential for abuse of using that operating statement to avoid proper planning. The other thing is, historically, at least in the Lower Fraser area, local governments were aware that if they're going to be putting in a bridge, they would need an authorization from DFO. It would encourage them to plan around that. Or we could use it as a way to say to the local government, look, we know you're going to have to put bridges in there that will require an authorization. We're not going to be inclined to issue an authorization if the works associated with that bridge aren't up to standard. So it kind of got us out of I would say a regulatory hook or tool.
And Mr. Crow, can you talk to us a little bit about small boat moorage, the dock operating statement that I guess would have a little bit more use in your area of the province?
This is an example of an operational statement, that has been problematic in the BC Interior. Essentially, the problem is that our lake shores are very important for fish rearing and spawning, and therefore it's important to maintain them in a very healthy, productive condition. But there's a directly competing interest, which is to use these same areas for recreational values, where individuals want to derive the personal benefit and enjoyment of their property, and respect and understand that. And quite common with recreational properties is a desire to have a dock. So we determined that we could not keep up with the considerable number of referrals for docks, and using an operational statement to try to streamline that referral process was initiated. And the result was that we set some standards around the size of docks and some general guidance on locations. But the challenge is that that they can be placed on spawning grounds, and as well in close proximity to fish rearing, and we don't have ability to, because we're not looking at them, we cannot actually direct a dock's location relative to known spawning areas. We encourage an individual to do some research to find out if their dock may be in proximity to spawning habitat, and but they're not compelled to do so. Additionally, that there's a high likelihood that dock could be in proximity to important rearing habitat, and but that's not actually avoidance of important rearing habitat is not a condition. Added to that same operational statement actually says that you can build a boathouse on the foreshore, including the removal of trees and making modifications to construct such a boathouse. So that also is contrary to many of our objectives in terms of protecting the foreshore and the in-water habitat. So it's an operational statement that is problematic, and I mean, we're realistic here in that there is more work than the department can manage as a habitat management program, and we need to find ways to manage elements of the lower risk spectrum of our business in an efficient and effective manner. But yes, there's some operational statements we believe are continuing to contribute to the ongoing cumulative incremental harm to habitat.
And does the Pacific region have the ability to modify these operational statements for the Pacific region, or would you simply be able to add additional ones in the Pacific region?
No, if we can have these operational statements modified or deemed to not apply in our region, but yeah, it's there is an administrative process within the department that we go through to have those changes made.
Right, and have an EH operating statement or the dock operating statement?
They some changes to the dock operational statement were already made. There were no limitations on how close these docks were could be to each other. So, for example, a strata development with 20 properties could have each property could have its own dock, and there's now a minimum distance required between docks. We've had that change made. These other changes have not been made yet.
Okay, well, and on the bridge OS?
Sorry.
Yeah, there's been some modifications to the regional OS.
But the problems that you talked about today are still not addressed in the existing OS?
No, those fundamental problems I think are hard to address.
Okay.
Ms. Baker, you may be coming to this,
Yep.
or your learned friends may be covering it, but just so I understand the context in which these answers are being given this morning, the document on the screen at the moment, I think has been marked as Exhibit 1002.
Yep.
And it's dated 2004, which from the evidence I heard this morning, I understand is about the time that changes are starting to happen in terms of downsizing and other
Right.
adjustments being made. In this particular document, there is reference to both the requirements for the province as well as for DFO. And the steps that have to be taken with respect to both the province and DFO are set out thoroughly in this document. Do I take it from these recent answers that the content of this document you've had marked as an exhibit, and the steps that persons are supposed to be taking, as outlined in here, are no longer relevant?
The document that's on the screen is a provincial and DFO BMP document, not an operational statement document, which is what we've been talking about just now.
No, but what I was trying to understand is that, for example, in this document on page 26, I'm not sure if it'll be the same, page 26. Just at the bottom there, it explains how DFO is involved in what persons are supposed to be doing and the steps they're supposed to take. Do I take it that this has been all changed, altered, modified?
I'll let the witnesses answer that.
Sir, if we can just have a moment to review this.
So, yes, this, leading up to 2004 and for the time around 2004, this would be an accurate description of the approach taken. And then sometime after 2005 in EPMP, there was a number of national and regional operating statements that were put in place, which were essentially an alternate to following this approach. It's not inconsistent necessarily with this approach, but they were standalone documents. If you pulled up that operating statement, read it, designed your project to meet it, you were in theory good to go without being in conflict with the Fisheries Act.
So if I'm a member of the public and I want to understand the jurisdictional differences between the province and the federal government requirements, I wouldn't be using this document. I have to go to something else.
I think this document is still relevant to how DFO might approach proposed works. The operating statements are an alternate. They're not identified in here. And we have updated our website recently to provide a bit more of a detailed approach to that question.
Mr. Commissioner, what I would offer is that this is still a relevant a statement and approach. What we've done is we've taken specific work activities and said that there's now a new stream for how those will be managed. So if your work falls within these 19 operational statements, you do not need to go through this process. You can just apply that operational statement. So determine your project type and then determine if you can use, you have to go through the traditional review process, or you can just apply this operational statement.
I see.
Yesterday we talked about environmental review committees within local governments and also reviews of official community plans that DFO would become involved in. Did that change around this time when there were reductions and changes and the EPMP was brought in and the other issues we discussed this morning came into play?
Yes. So through the 90s and into early 2000, virtually any significant work in or about a stream was referred to the province either as a notification or a formal application under the Water Act. And so the province basically was in a position to touch all those or respond to all of those. We worked with the province at DFO to share that workload, in that fisheries and ocean staff would often deal with the more significant proposals or ones that would most likely require a formal Fisheries Act authorization. There's still a significant workload, and there was recognition that local government had a big part to play in a lot of that workload. And so what we did was form environmental review committees where the province, DFO, the municipal planning, engineering, and approvals groups would get together and review packages of maintenance activities, development proposals, etc. And it was a much more streamlined approach. It was also useful because it gave us a working relationship with individuals in local government. We could educate each other about our objectives. We could identify innovative ways to deal with things. It gave us a window into local government planning. We would often discuss broader scale plans at that table. It was quite efficient. When at some point, it was around 2002, that the province decided they were no longer going to be reviewing all those notifications in detail. They also decided that they would not provide that review role at an ERC. And so the ERC foundation fell apart to some extent. And it was often just DFO and the local government that would meet if the local government still felt the need.
So in your area, you described how you had been involved in many environmental review committees in the Lower Fraser. Have you stopped participating in those entirely, or do you still participate in some?
We still participate in some. Some are fairly active. Others are a lot less regular, and some have discontinued.
And do you continue to work with the province on developing best management practices, as we discussed earlier?
I can't think of any significant efforts around that over the last 5 years at least.
Okay. Could I have Exhibit 662 brought up? A memo that was drafted by Jason Wong. He identified this earlier on April 5th in this inquiry. Are you familiar with this memo, either of you?
Yes, I am.
And Mr. Salome?
I have read it at some point, yes.
All right. Does this, Mr. Crow, does this reflect your views at the time?
Yes, it does. I'm in agreement with it.
And Mr. Salome?
Yes, for the most part.
Okay. There's one line in this document I just wanted to ask you about. In the second paragraph, I've got this right. It says that EPMP and staff reductions have reduced our ability to engage with proponents. Meeting the regulatory minimum is not as favorable for fish habitat as what we used to be able to do, which was to get the lowest viable impact. Can you explain what that means? I guess, Mr. Crow, you might be best able to explain what that means.
Essentially what it means is when we engage directly with the proponent, we are able to understand the details of the development plans, assess what the likely impacts are to the project, to fish and fish habitat, and set expectations, usually through some form of written guidance on what we expect of them to avoid harm or mitigate or compensate for effects to habitat. So getting the lowest viable impact is that engagement and negotiation to minimize the overall effect. Streamlining tools that draw us out of that direct engagement essentially is that and provide a guidance document to essentially act as a surrogate for that detailed review and comment is what is meant by the regulatory minimum, and that the opinion is that we, by relying on a tool to deliver a regulatory minimum, we will not get the same effect as previously when we had more staff and more direct engagement.
And Mr. Salome, is this when you were talking about the bridge operating statement and the lack of ability now to get engaged in planning, is that a reflection of the same concern?
That would be a good example of my interpretation of what is written in the paragraph.
Can you just remind me, Ms. Baker, of what RAR is?
That's the riparian area regulation, which we're going to get into in quite a lot of detail soon.
Could I just ask the panel this question? Mr. Crow, you mentioned, and I think it would not be a secret to say that the growth that we've experienced in the Lower Mainland as well as in the interior appears to continue with regard to population growth and activity. And you both mentioned the provincial government's involvement, and this document mentions local governments and says not meeting the spirit and intent, etc. I'm going to assume that the challenges faced by DFO regarding, I think using your words, we have more work than we can manage. I think that probably would apply to the provincial government counterparts that you have as well as local government. Is the cooperation between local, provincial, and federal agencies who are doing the work you're doing essential to be able to manage the challenges that are being faced by the growth in population and greater activity around streams and so on? Or can you each do it on your own. I have a sense that you were cooperating at one point, but that seems, at least in the last 5 years, to not be as strong.
The landscape we're trying to manage is, for our direct interest to protect fish and fish habitat is overlaps with many other agencies' jurisdictions and responsibilities and objectives between agencies as well as levels of government. And no one can work in a stovepipe in this field where it's essential for the purposes of good governance and expectations of the public that government cooperate and try to, wherever possible, ensure that we act in a coordinated and cooperative manner. And it also, so therefore it's incumbent when we're dealing in an area where jurisdictions overlap and objectives often are somewhat similar or even diametrically opposed, that we do our utmost within government to try to cooperate. So essentially, wherever possible, we do try to work together. It also speaks to the fact that where our outcomes are somewhat similar, our objectives are quite similar, it can be beneficial to every agency to cooperate and try to figure out what the best way to get it and an outcome is. Sometimes it may be using the Fisheries Act, maybe sometimes other times using a local government objective. With downsizing through the early to mid 2000s, I'd say the province as well as ourselves had to retrench and focus on what our core objectives was, with the realization that did create some dysfunction for everyone, and that we've been building back some of those cooperative relationships since the mid to later 2000s. But with regards to local government, that's actually, I'd say the province and DFO have very similar objectives, and we find it relatively easy to cooperate and do so as much as possible. Local governments, and I'll speak to the Interior, it's a bit more of a challenge because, in my opinion, local governments often have an objective that is quite contrary to at least my agency's objectives. They're interested in community development, servicing the desires and wishes of their constituents, and that often means expanding development activities in close proximity to water to meet recreational or private landowner or commercial objectives. And with pressures from those groups on local governments, they don't always necessarily, they're not always able to work as easily with ourselves as we are with the province. Where possible, we definitely try to formulate those those arrangements, such as ERCs, but in the Interior we have not had the same degree of success.
Thank you. If I can ask for document 6 on the Commission's list to be brought up. This is a review paper that was prepared, I understand, by you, Mr. Crow, in 2007. Do you recognize that document?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And this sets out, the staffing changes between 2003 and 2007. And it shows, just looking at the column on the first page, a reduction of 20 FTEs, or full-time equivalents, down to 8. That's correct?
That's correct.
Could I have this mark, please?
Exhibit 1003.
Right.
And sorry, I'll just add, and we have actually gone down further since then.
Okay. What is your current staffing?
7.
And this was a result of what? Maybe you can just explain why the staffing reduced so much. I know you've already explained in a general way, so if that's the answer, we can move on. But if there's some more detail you want to give.
No, it was the discontinuation of some B-based funding, long-standing B-based funding programs, ERC, and the general redistribution of resources within Pacific region and among larger financial decisions in DFO.
All right. And page 9 of this memo, well, so first of all, I'll just explain, this memo sets out, leading up to page 9, the different staff positions and outlines the workload that they have after the reductions in staffing, correct?
Yes.
It doesn't set out your particular workload, and you're one of the people that's been left in that group, so I take it you had to pick up a lot of the work that was being done by some of the people who left?
That's correct. Though in my role, it's more about trying to balance and manage and apply judgment and how we're going to direct our day-to-day resources and make long-term planning decisions with my manager and counterparts.
Okay. Page 9 of this document sets out the an overview of program changes over the past year. I take it that has there been any substantive change to what's set out in this document since 2007?
I wouldn't say substantive. I should also explain that this is a time where it was sort of a perfect storm of converging challenges. The province was going through changes and downsizing. We were going through changes and downsizing. We were developing new program delivery tools such as through EPMP, and we're putting a lot of our direction in trying to actually create new tools, risk management frameworks, triaging systems, the operational statements. At the same time, the development sector was escalating, so declining REIT capacity and increasing workload was a real problem for us. So this is a sort of a one-page summary of the things that we were essentially having to change in our program. It was a one-page synthesis of everything we were doing to try to manage for those compounding challenges.
You said there hasn't been any significant changes. I just want to go to a couple of them. A number of bullets down, and I'm not going to try and count them. You say that you no longer participate in local government foreshore planning initiatives such as CSRD, Chase, Kamloops, and Sicamous. Now, not all of those areas are relevant for Fraser Sockeye, but yeah. CSRD is certainly, in Kamloops maybe as well. Yeah. Has that changed? Yeah, actually, I'm glad you brought that one up, because that is one change, in that a little while after this document was written, under primarily provincial leadership, the Shuswap Lake Integrated Planning process was initiated amongst all levels of government and other groups to try to deal with the very substantial problems with development and the rate of development and nature of development within the Shuswap area. So understanding just how what I would describe as a mess it was in terms of the character and nature of development in Shuswap. It was essential that we get on board with a provincial initiative to try to deal with this in a more coordinated manner between governments. Okay, that's great, and I will come back and talk about that program in a bit more detail. But another bullet here which I wanted to ask you about, it says Ministry of the Environment provides almost no assistance to DFO in the management of HADs and resident water. There's even examples of Ministry of Environment causing delays by trying to keep them engaged to provide advice. What does that actually mean? That's not clear to me. Sorry, I appreciate I wrote this document, but I can't. Can you point me to the bullet? It's just, we were looking at the CSRD bullet. It's just 3 below that. Oh, thank you. This related to some of the provincial changes where they were not performing the same role that they had done historically with regards to giving advice or direction to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in when I say management of HADs. There's essentially an arrangement where the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is a lead regulator for development activities in salmon-bearing waters, and the province is a lead agency in resident fish-bearing waters. But only the Department of Fisheries and Oceans can authorize a HAD, harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. So essentially in resident fish-bearing waters, if a development is proposing one of these, a HAD, the province would take the lead up until, and in the management up until the point it would actually be, and the authorization would be issued, and then the Department of Fisheries and Oceans would issue the authorization. With provincial changes, the province is no longer providing that same role and expecting DFO to
engaged far more greatly in the review and management of those HADs in resident fresh water. So essentially, we were stepping into the province's traditional role in those resident freshwater situations. That has somewhat adjusted again in negotiations with the province, and I think the understanding by the province is that was actually problematic for meeting their fisheries objectives. They have, I can't say everywhere, but in large parts of the area that I'm responsible for, the province has stepped back into that role.
All right, and when they were out of that role, it sounds like it's just dealing with non-salmon bearing waters, but did that have any impact on your ability to manage the salmon bearing waters?
Well, the consequence of having to step into resident fish habitat project reviews was that it left us less resources to apply to salmon bearing waters. So essentially it was a dilution of our further dilution of our effectiveness.
Right, and then the last couple of bullets talks about the fact that there are fewer stewardship programs resulting in a lack of public awareness, knowledge, and voluntary protection. Then you also refer to the fact that you're not considered a partner with ENGOs anymore. And if we just flip the page, there's one more that's sort of a related concept where you talk about a reduced field role, which is resulting in more infractions. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that. What's the impact of sort of dropping back in the field and dropping back in terms of stewardship and partnering with the NGOs? How does that have an impact?
When you have a field presence and you're engaged with industry sectors and the public, there's an awareness of us and our objectives and the need to protect fish and fish habitat. Essentially familiarity breeds knowledge. When you are no longer engaging with individuals in the same manner as frequently, and people don't see you as much, there is a tendency to forget about your objectives and a fallback towards practices that would we had thought were managed, and that we were finding that there was tendencies towards increased rates of development or actions that were resulting in increased harm to habitat. So essentially, not being in the field, not maintaining a presence, resulted in an increase in reports of occurrences of harm or potential violations of the Fisheries Act.
All right, and Mr. Salmi, is there anything you wanted to add to these comments?
The BC Interior Office had a more significant increase in staff and then drop in staff. The change in the Lower Fraser was not quite as dramatic, but we faced similar challenges.
Okay. Mr. Commissioner, I'm going to move next to RAR, the Riparian Areas Regulation, so this would be a good time to take the break if you would like.
Has this been marked?
Yeah, it was marked as Exhibit 1003.
1,000.
Wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's tab 6 of Commission Council.
Right.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.